At this Africa Day, we're looking at the long-standing debate on this continent, Africa relying on foreign aid for decades. Lives have been saved, but experts have argued that the provision of foreign aid has contributed to a culture of dependence. At the 2022 Trialogue Business in Society conference, civil and private sector leaders discussed how Africa could liberate itself from international donor dependency. To discuss, we're joined by the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Sello Hatang. We're also joined by senior researcher for the Institute for Global Dialogue, that's Faith Mabera. Thank you both for being with me. Let me start with you, Mr. Hatang. Can we start with your own experience? How does Nelson Mandela Foundation attract funding? What's it used for? And apparently you did have a shift, a change in your reliance on foreign donors because of COVID. Tell us the story.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Good evening. I think for us, the important thing to reflect on at the time like this is the continent has, for the longest of time, been attracting this foreign donor funding. And in a way, it not only created dependency, but also it created a way out for those corporates, for example, corporate citizens, who should be contributing, who are not playing their part in a big way. I need to hasten to add also that one of the contributions we had was from, I think it was Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who said we should also be noting that this what Africa gets out of those foreign, particularly the West, and it's what belongs to Africa. For the longest of time, they've been extracting, taking our stuff, including our artifacts, and liquidity in our country, in their countries, was dependent on the stuff they were getting from us. So it's time for them to pay back in a very tangible way, in terms of justice being set right. As the NMF, when COVID hit, we were maybe about 90% dependent on Europe and the US. But the global politics changed, and most of that money then started focusing inward. The Trump era meant that the US no longer had the best way of defending democracy and values. Then it meant that most of those donors had to now think about putting that money in their own countries. Here in South Africa, we then started knocking at doors of South African corporates and individuals. And it was amazing to see that they came on board, and we could help over 100,000 families who were destitute during that time, for example. So it tells you that we can. We just have to rethink and reset and start unlearning what we had normalized in the past.
All right, so you're talking about tapping into this local potential. I'll come back to that. Ms. Mabera, is there changes that other NGOs are witnessing as well? The last stats I saw were that about 90% of civil society organizations are dependent on international donor funding in Africa.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I think the dependency that we see at the national level and at the regional level is just a microcosm of what we see at the continental level. And while the broader subject of the day is the donor dependency that we've seen from the AU as a continental organization, I think at the subnational level, this is can also be attributed to just the kind of absorption capacity that we have across. And if you want to mirror it also with what we see at the AU, for instance, peace and security taking a huge sum of the AU's budget, and actually the kind of funding that it gets from its foreign donors. And this is also reflective at the subnational level, because what tends to happen is that with the allocation of priorities, for instance, and the allocation of funding that's, for instance, demand-driven, tends to focus more on what are seen as the higher stake, high politics issues of peace and security, while your quote-unquote low politics issues tend to receive relatively lower funding. So this we also see money and donations seem to follow also the interests of key donors, and this is what dictates where the purse comes from.
Are you saying that the implication is that money hasn't always been channeled to the right issues or the right people?
The issue is that we all know that for the funders, for instance, who are channeling funds at a particular cause, they will have to also have certain calculus and rationale behind their funding. So we can't always assume that there is a purely altruistic motive for some of the funding that comes to. It speaks to what Mr. Hatang was saying about we must always check not only the motives and the self-interest of the donors and where, for instance, we have common interests, but at the end of the day, he who pays the piper is the one who dictates the tune that is to be played, and this is certainly the dynamics that's reflective across the board.
Mr. Hatang, I'm so glad that you can talk about your foundation and you're willing to. Were there strings attached when there were international donors? This is a concern that we often hear voiced. I remember a government minister being very concerned about the funding for NGOs involved in adoption and looking after abandoned children. Is there something to back up that suspicion?
Look, we should also be careful that in some instances it's used as this ghost that's always hanging over NGOs because government wants to put in more restrictions on access to resources. So we should be careful not to fall for that trap. However, what Ms. Mabera says, it's also very important because in some instances you find that a donor comes through and they then want even your mandate to change. You're going on this course and they're saying, no, actually, we would like you to then follow this course. I have to say that the foundation speaks from a point of privilege. And I am owning that privilege. As an institution, we can and we have been able to afford to say, no, we don't want to do that, and this is what we want to do. Not all organizations can. And it's important that as we do so, we also recognize that the needs on the ground that are being fulfilled, in some instances, it's not the big NGOs like us who have to then deal with those difficulties. It's actually the CBO that's working directly with the communities. That's why we then partner with those so that we don't come in with a solution that doesn't actually respond to the needs on the ground. Our early childhood development work, for example, it's informed by early childhood practitioners. What do they need? How do they need to be supported? And when we get an international donor to come on board, they come with the mandate that comes from those communities directly. Yeah. So on the one hand, we must be careful that we shouldn't be listening only to government telling us, well, we should treat these donors with suspicion, because sometimes that's just a way out to ensure that they can then interfere with sometimes even real abuses that then happen of funds, etc. And accountability. Most of the time, you find that if you go to those CBOs, they are really accountable too.
Ms. Mabera, is there a potential solution here where local NGOs that are accepting funding make sure that they are delivering solutions from the ground up for the communities, so it's not dictated by global donations or the people giving those? What's the solution looking forward? Because and how do we see things like UN agencies? The World Food Programme is going to become so much more important on this continent, surely, but we are a member of the UN because of the issues around starvation right now.
Yes, and I think it's important here to separate the two issues. Programmatic funding for multilateral organizations is one separate matter from, for instance, private donations or civil society organizations that rely, for instance, on philanthropy. Those are two separate sources of funding. So we should be careful, for instance, not to conflate the two. But also regarding your question about what seems to be happening, there's a lot of options out there. A lot of organizations are tapping into crowdfunding resources. And one way of doing this is also they're opening up stakes, they're opening up they're moving away from opacity in terms of their operations, reaching out across the aisle. For instance, in the case of civil society groupings, they're bringing in the people in, sort of opening their books, opening the program areas, and extending a hand to allow broad-based participation by citizens who then become willing, so I'd say volunteers or even donors in that sense. So enlarging that stake and making citizens feel that they're part of the solution is one aspect when you look at the crowdfunding. But also increasingly, we've seen another alternative is to also launch into partnerships across like-minded countries. One notion that comes to mind is, for instance, tapping into South-South cooperation, an element of development cooperation that looks to also bring in like-minded partners across the globe, and ensuring that you align your programs with key development agendas, for instance, such as the SDGs. And this is one way of also leveraging shared mindsets, and one way of also leveraging ownership and horizontal funding.
And interesting what you were saying earlier, so you don't have these big donors anymore, but sort of dispersed donors and people getting involved. We have so much more to discuss, but we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Nelson Mandela Foundation CEO Sello Hatang and the Institute for Global Dialogue's Senior Researcher Faith Mabera. Thank you.